Do you think there's a distrust for the younger people in wisdom then? Because they're like, I can just go find it myself. I don't need to listen to you.
Yeah, and I think it's a funny thing, like, because I've been a youth minister a long time. Yeah. I really like teenage culture, and I loved teenagers because it's almost like a reset every generation. So the human race, it strives to excess all the time. And then each generation, teenagers rebel against what happened in the earlier generation, and sort of, it means that there's something good about that, but there's also a downside. So the downside obviously is that there's no solutions to the problems I'm experiencing now from the past, and all the solutions are in the present or the future. And that sort of view of history is not helpful either.
Welcome back to the Shock Absorber podcast, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Joel. I am one of the co-hosts on this podcast, and it is wonderful to have another co-host here along with me, Stu. Welcome.
Hello, Joel.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome. How are you? I was just commenting. We talk about your. Unfortunately, I just as a way of making conversation, I comment on what you guys are wearing usually.
Yes, you do.
And you've got your Sharks gear on, which is cool, but I noticed that you have John Deere socks on. Yes. Because I love your John Deere hat, but you got the John Deere socks.
I do. So I have some Sharks gear on because I was going to go down to the Sharks today, but there's some pastoral matters that I needed to attend to, so I couldn't go down. So hence my gear that I'm wearing, I suppose.
Because you are the chaplain of Cronulla Sharks.
Yeah, the chaplain of Cronulla Sharks NRL football team, and which is delightful. And yeah, I was just saying before we started recording that I've been sharing with people. Well, it all started okay, I'll just tell you quickly. So I grew up in the country for a little while, as well as the city. Narrandera, which is in southwestern New South Wales, just outside of Wagga Wagga. And I loved that time of my life. It was it was only a short amount of time, but it was very formative. So it was like the end of primary school, beginning of high school, kind of time. So I've got a lot of fond memories from that. And my dad was a bank manager. That's why we went down there. And so every Saturday he took us out to a different farm for like 2 or 3 years. It was amazing. We just so many farms. And I just really loved farming and driving around on motorbikes and big tractors and stuff like that. So anyway, so I talk about Narrandera sometimes at home. And for Christmas, my wife Lou was in a surf shop of all places and found a hat that had John Deere on it. So I don't know how that's trendy in a surf shop, but somehow it is. And she thought that's fun, so I'll buy that for Stu. So John Deere is one of my favourite tractors. I also like International and Massey Ferguson as well.
Oh, I don't know Massey Ferguson.
Yeah, there you go, Massey Ferguson combine harvesters. So anyway, so Lou gets me this hat, and then that starts a thing. And there's something about my personality that when I get into something, I talk about it. And the other thing about that is people tend to sort of then buy me stuff that's John Deere. So Brado's bought me 2 little John Deere tractors for my office. Okay. And for my birthday yesterday, Ethan and Katie, my son and daughter-in-law, bought me some John Deere socks. Wow. So now I have John Deere socks. So it's becoming a thing, I think. So there you go.
It's pretty funny. It's similar. Is that why you got into SpaceX so much? You wanted someone to buy you a rocket?
Oh, I'd love a rocket. How good would that be? Did you see the last launch 4?
Did it almost land on its own?
It didn't almost land. It landed.
It did.
In the water, though. Oh, yeah, that's where you say almost, yeah. It didn't land back on the platform, but they've got it. It's pretty cool, actually.
I think I saw a tweet from Elon saying that next time it's going to land back on the same platform.
Yeah, they're going to try and catch it with chopsticks.
Oh, because it encloses it?
They call the arms on the thing chopsticks.
Okay, cool.
It's very, very cool.
It is very cool, but I think sometimes with space, I'm just like, it's so far out there, I don't have time to dedicate to being interested.
I understand that. Yeah.
But I do think your interest in space exploration fits your personality.
Does it? There you go. Yeah.
Oh, you always want to push the boundaries.
I like that. I thought you were more referring to the nerdy side of my personality, which is also true. It's a little bit of a space nerd. Oh, yeah. I really, really like space. Ever since I was a little kid, I read this book by Heinlein called Have Spacesuit Will Travel when I was little. I reckon it's even a good read for adults, actually. It's a cracker of a book. So it's about this little boy who makes his own rocket or something and goes into space, which is pretty much what Elon Musk has done.
Yeah, that's right. He's actually done it, though.
Yeah.
Rather than just
all these detractors and people's comments on whether it's worth doing, it is quite remarkable.
Making it happen.
Apparently he went over to Russia to go and ask them for one of their ballistic missiles they weren't using, so he could try and use that as a space rocket.
Wow.
And they said, no, you can't have one. So apparently came home on the plane and thought, I'll make my own. So apparently that's how it started.
I was just thinking, like, how is he moving a ballistic missile?
Well, I wouldn't know how he'd do it either.
Yeah.
Presumably, you'd have to take the warhead off it.
Yeah.
I can't think they'd let him take that.
Well, maybe that inspired him because that's why he wants it to land back there. Because to move it, you'd have to probably fire it over to the US or something.
Probably.
And then you're like, what do you do when it gets
He could
there?
probably fit a ballistic missile inside the rocket he's made, actually.
Oh,
It's
right.
that big. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, sorry, because the ballistic missiles would probably be a bit smaller than than the space ones.
Yeah, probably.
I do find the technology and stuff involved in, how they just can land a missile
it's crazy.
Like perfectly. It's crazy that can happen.
I don't get it either. It's also cool how they get a rocket to land it. So have you seen the other rockets they get to land?
I think
the boosters that come back down and land on the same. It's amazing.
That is amazing. They can actually manage to make that happen.
Some clever people.
Having said that, I didn't enjoy space. I do enjoy, for some reason, the space shuttle. I don't know why.
Yeah, I love that too.
It's just like a cool thing. Or because that comes back, doesn't it?
It does. Used to, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, they don't use it anymore.
No, they've got a thing called the space plane now, which is a small version of it. But no one knows what it's doing. It's just orbiting around the Earth.
Oh, really?
They launched one and it just went around the Earth for 3 years, and no one knows what it was doing.
With no one in it or anything.
No one in it, just flying around.
Oh, it's like the Russians spent sending a dog up there first or something.
They did.
They sent a couple of different animals up there, I think.
Monkeys.
It just seems funny. I don't know why.
Sheffield United supporters, I think they sent something.
It just makes me think they sent, the monkeys in Jungle Book. They're just having a great old time in the rocket, just bashing around in the rocket.
I don't think they had a good time though, actually. I can't believe I said Sheffield United supporters. My apologies to any Sheffield United supporters listening.
Yeah, that's a bit harsh. If you don't know, Stu is a Sheffield Wednesday supporter.
I am, yeah.
So
just a friendly banter there, that was all.
They are the Derby rivals.
The Derby rivals,
that's what we call
yeah.
You said that you wanted to talk about a show you watched recently.
Yes. The cultural artefact for today for me is, we're talking about costly discipleship and actually making a change. I think living as exiles in
a digital Babylon.
A digital Babylon. I like that. It's very interesting. I'm heaps keen to hear from you what you guys have been talking about in the last couple of weeks, because I've been off doing things.
Hopefully I can remember.
Yeah, I'm sure. Anyway, this cultural artefact that I really liked was Louise, my wife, and I watched this documentary on SBS a couple of nights ago, which is an Australian TV channel, and they've got a documentary on that at the moment, which you can look at on SBS On Demand. It's really worth a watch. It's called Fly With Me, and it explores the first female flight attendants and how they were on the forefront of women's rights. And they were asserting gender equality and transforming the workplace. So it's a really interesting story about how that started. And what I found really interesting was the early flights that they had. The first thing I learned from the documentary was they were really rubbish. So they weren't actually a good experience. So you could get on a plane in New York and you didn't know if it was going to get right across the country because it might break down. So they had to land sometimes for up to a day or two at a time to get it fixed and things like that. There were some crashes, but the worst part of it was just unreliability. When the weather was bad, they had to land. They didn't fly very high, so it was very bumpy. So a lot of turbulence because they could only fly up to 10,000 feet rather than get above most of the turbulence. And so they were looking at, and all the fumes were coming into the cabin.
Oh, wow.
People were smoking. And it's probably awful. And so
when was this, the 60s?
Oh, good question.
50s, 60s?
I think 50s, maybe even late 40s, 50s.
Okay.
Yeah, late 40s or 50s. And then what they came up with was they thought, how can we make this a better experience for people? So they thought of this idea of flight attendants, and they had exclusively female flight attendants. And the idea was that they were to kind of serve the customers food and drink and try and be a bit friendly.
Yep.
And also, there was wrapped up in that a bit of sexism, because of the way they got treated on the planes and stuff like that. But then what the series does is it looks, as the planes got better and more sophisticated, just what was a flight attendant. And, the flight attendant's journey sort of mirrored women in the broader culture. So, there was this expectation that they had to be single, they had to be young. So they had to retire, can't exactly remember, but it was something like 32, they had to retire.
Mm-hmm.
and they weren't allowed to be older, and they couldn't get married, and they couldn't have kids,
Wow.
and they had to be single. So it was a bit difficult for them. So the ladies started to get together and formed a union, and they started to agitate. And they had these big public awareness campaigns saying, did you realise we're supposed to resign when we turn 32? And I had a really clever ad, which was all these 32-year-old flight attendants said, how old are we? So there's this big campaign, how old am I? And it was really, everyone's like, well, you look the same as the 20-year-olds. So, but then they were saying, what does it matter what we look like? Why does it matter? So then, bit by bit, they started to change the whole thing, and then they could get married, they could stay longer and all that sort of stuff. So, I found that really interesting. And the reason I think it ties in for today is they were actually not just trying to be comfortable in the world, they were trying to make the world a better place, how they saw it. And I think as Christians, sometimes we can become a bit too consumeristic, focused on therapeutic Christianity, which is a Christianity that helps me to feel like I can cope in this world. And I think if I understand the conversation so far over the last couple of weeks, maybe one way of looking at it is that we're talking about moving from just surviving as a Christian in this world to thriving as a Christian in this world. So if we understand our context and we understand our identity as Christ's, belonging to Christ, then how do we transform the world as we fly in it?
Oh, wow.
There you go.
That was a very good segue. Well done.
There you go.
I did have one question, though, about in terms of watching this show, which was called Australia Come Fly With Me.
Yep.
Interestingly, presented by Justine Clark, who's usually on Play School and has written many kids songs.
Yeah, she was, I think how old would she have been? Would she have been on Play School when I was watching it?
Oh, I don't think so.
Or when my kids were watching it?
Probably
Maybe
your
when my
kids, I'd say.
Because it was a bit disconcerting, because sometimes I was expecting her to get the Play-Doh out. Now I know why.
Right. My question was...
or make a rocket out of cardboard or something.
All right, enough of the rockets. Back in your university days, you lectured on kind of issues like this, and that this show is exploring. Did that? How did you kind of interpret that, given that what you'd learned and taught? What was kind of your response to watching this show? Yeah,
I really like seeing. Like I don't know what our listeners and viewers think, or what you think, but it's nice when you know about a topic, but then you see something that goes deeper into it.
Oh yeah.
Particularly when something is well produced and well done, and it's sort of even more interesting when you see it from different angles. And I think we're so busy these days and we're bombarded by so much information that sometimes we don't do deep dives into particular topics. So for me, it was a deep dive into an area of feminism that I didn't know much about. So I found it really interesting because one of the lovely things about the show was they were talking about the glamour and just the prestige of flying in the early days. Now it's just like catching a bus, really. But I think it was Paul Keating who called pilots are glorified bus drivers when they were on strike once, which I think was very unfair to all the pilots out there and to the bus drivers too, actually. I think it's a double-handed.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway. But what was really interesting is they said that at the time, a single woman, it would have been incredibly unusual for a single woman to travel abroad by herself. Mm-hmm. And here's all these women who get to go all over the world.
Oh,
One day they're in Mexico City, the next day they're over in Brazil, the next day they're in Italy. And so they were talking about how wonderful that was. And I found that the most fun part of the documentary, just seeing how groups of single women were going around the world together and exploring the world. I thought that was really cool.
My perception of air travel, 50s, 60s, or it was like, it wasn't so much as a money-making exercise that it is now. Like how many people can we pack in the plane to make this profitable? It felt like it was more like almost like a consumer-led version of the space race, in a sense that it's like, how like luxurious can we make it, and how special can we make it?
I think that's
because I remember, didn't it start with like kind of like seaplanes and stuff that
wouldn't go Catalinas,
as far? Yeah.
So they had a Catalina that flew from London to Australia. Actually, my wife's father was an engineer on the Catalinas at Rose Bay in Sydney Harbour. Yep. And those boats used to take like a week to get here or something, and they'd land in all these exotic ports and they'd fly along. Yeah, pretty cool. But yeah, they had like smoking lounges, and they'd sit around drinking scotch in a lounge room on a plane. And
and the seats were really big.
The seats were really big, and I still remember. I'm old enough to remember what it was like to have smoking and non-smoking sections. Which was a bit of a joke because like it was all smoking.
Row 40 back is smoking.
Yeah. I remember getting on a plane on a non-smoking ticket on the way to somewhere, and it was a big seat, although I was a lot littler then. But I remember the guy behind me was started the smoking section. All the smoke was blowing through the crack in the seat. I was like, it was. They talk about the fact that they had these luxurious meals and all this kind of fine dining and stuff, but then there's like tobacco smoke and oil coming in the cabin, and
and the fumes and things like that.
The fumes, it's a bit of a mixed bag, really.
That is funny, kind of funny. I did like your point though about watching that show and getting additional insight. I love when you get like a bit of content. I know I've spoken about motor racing before, but when Motorsport Magazine, I found their podcast, and they had the two like kind of premier English writing journalists, or at least from England. On that podcast, and they had so many stories. I just devoured they had probably had like a year and a half with a podcast, and I found it and I devoured it within a week and a half. It was just like I'm just learning so much more that I didn't know before. I really enjoy that.
That's cool.
And even they have the Formula One series on Netflix now, which is called Drive to Survive, and it annoys me a lot because I'm like, I could watch this and learn more, and there's these little tidbits of insight, but the rest of it is just all hammed up, and I don't really enjoy that. But I do love it when you're like, I didn't like something I really enjoy, and like, I didn't know that about those kind of things.
I read a quote one time that said, interesting people are interested people.
Oh. Are you calling us interesting?
I think we might be. No, interesting people are interested people. So if you're interested in things and you're interested in other people, and you're actually, when you talk to someone and you're like interested in them, that's an engaging thing.
I like that quote. I want to use it. Say that I'm interesting. It's good. Let's move on to the rest of the podcast, because we have been talking about, based on the book that we've had a look at, is Faith for Exiles. And one of the four categories that they identified in terms of what we call exiles in a digital Babylon, which are prodigals who don't go to church, nomads who are unchurched, they identify as Christian but haven't attended during the past month. You've got the habitual churchgoers who go to church pretty regularly. They describe themselves as Christian, yet some of their behaviour doesn't really match core beliefs or behaviours associated with being an engaged disciple. And then the final one, which is the smallest one, is resilient disciples. And the book is looking about how can we move more towards resilient disciples. And there's 5 practices, I should say, that Dave Kinnaman and Mark Matlock have come up with to say this is how we can helpfully create more resilient disciples. We've mentioned someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer before, who is in costly discipleship, who's a great example of a very resilient disciple, I would suggest.
Yeah, very.
So out of the practices, we talked last week about practice 1, which is to form a resilient identity. And you need to form a resilient identity, you need to have experience and intimacy with Jesus. And I thought that was really cool to say how much of our identity is defined by Jesus, and then that informs the rest of our lives. Practice 2, though, which is probably, you would say probably more on the ground practical, is in practice 2, in a complex and anxious age, we need to develop the muscles of cultural discernment. And I was really glad that you're on this podcast, because that factors into a lot of things that you've talked about with Andy Crouch and creating Christian cultural goods. But there was one quote, which I'm just trying to find, here we go, that I thought could kick us off, and I'd see what your reaction is. They write here, cultural discernment about technology and so much more is an essential practice of following Jesus in the accelerated anxiety-producing complexity of a digital Babylon that we live in. What's your initial reactions?
Can you say that again?
So a cultural discernment, which is what this practice is about. We need to practice cultural discernment as a resilient disciple. It's about technology and way more than that. And it's an essential practice of following Jesus in the accelerated, anxiety-producing complexity of a digital Babylon. I think some of the things he's talking about there is perhaps the amount of choice that the technology presents to us too, and that we sometimes need to, and that produces anxiety because everything's faster paced, so much choice, what's the right thing to do. That's what the digital Babylon creates. But did you have any other reactions to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting observation about anxiety being produced by choice. We've mentioned on the podcast before that there was a survey done in Britain, in London particularly, during the Blitz in the Second World War, and they measured somehow people's anxiety levels during the Blitz. And then after the war, they kept examining people's anxiety levels, and they found that people in the 1990s had higher anxiety in London than people living during the Blitz.
Wow.
And the authors of that study, which the title escapes me at the moment, suggested that their thought was that in the Blitz you only had 2 or 3 things to think about: staying alive, eating, and staying alive. Pretty much.
I was going to say.
Maybe working or whatever,
Yeah.
but yeah, you pretty much didn't have a lot of choice. And then they contrasted that with the 1990s, and in the 1990s you could walk into a shop and go to buy a soft drink, we call it in Sydney, some people call it soda or whatever, and you might go, oh, I feel like a drink, I feel like a soft drink. You look at the fridge and there's Coke and there's Pepsi and there's Mountain Dew and there's lemonade and there's orange and there's all these choices, and you're like, oh, I'll have a cola. Okay, do I want Coke or do I want Pepsi? And then you go, okay, I'll have Coke. And then it's like, well, do I have Diet Coke or do I have Coke Zero or do I have Coke? And then, I'll have Coke Zero. Oh, well, will I have it in a bottle or will I have it in a can? Have it in a bottle. Well, do I want a big bottle or do I want a little bottle? And it's like, by the time you go to the counter to pay for it, you're already going, oh, should I have got a Pepsi instead? Or maybe I should have had a glass of milk. And so apparently that creates a lot of anxiety for us. And you see in people that have really high-powered lives that they reduce their choices. So you see people like Steve Jobs when he was still alive, just wearing the same T-shirt every day.
Wasn't it the turtleneck and the jeans?
Something like that, yeah. And he was just wearing that all the time because he's like, I can't be bothered thinking about what I wear. Apparently Einstein was asked for his phone number one day, and he had to get his wallet out, and he got a piece of paper out and he read out his phone number to the person. And they said, like, you're the smartest person on earth and you can't remember your phone number? He goes, I've got too many other things to think about. So there seems, and you know, if all that was true in the past, like in the 90s and stuff, how much more true is it now? And how much are we bombarded every day with so many things? So yeah, I think our brains are designed to have a certain capacity. I don't know much about all that. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. But just like people weren't designed to travel at 200 kilometres an hour, and if they're in a car that crashes, the human body doesn't usually cope too well with a crash at 200 kilometres an hour. But if your human body that's designed to probably at most run, 4 kilometres an hour, maybe, speed, I don't know, how fast a person can run.
Oh, I don't know. I think the 100-metre runners are a lot faster than that. But
well, let's say, I don't know, 9 kilometres an hour?
Yeah, something like that.
And then fall over and graze your knee. But,
Yeah.
you know, you don't need a helmet and body armour to protect yourself from an injury that you cause through self-sustained mobility. So similar, our brains maybe aren't meant to be awake as long as we are today. They're not meant to be, you know, like human beings used to go to bed when the sun went down, go to sleep, and then wake up when the sun came up. Now we have electric light. It's sustained more thinking time. If you think about social media and all the comparisons we're making to ourselves and other people, you know, there was a time where, for example, attractiveness is all around us in the modern world. It has been all my life through TV and posters. There's always all these attractive people presented to me in all these different forms. And now there's so many attractive people on the internet that you compare yourself to all these people, and it's a bit stressful because you think, oh, am I tall enough, or am I, you know, strong enough? Am I whatever? Is my nose the right shape, or all these things? Whereas, you know, again, sociologists have made the comment that back in the pre-modern era, when people didn't travel much, there might have been one pretty person in a village and then everybody else was pretty normal. So if you saw one pretty person in your lifetime, you're like, wow, okay, that person's pretty attractive. But now there's just pretty people everywhere. So the vast majority of people, you know, everyone's beautiful, I think, but culture presents a certain kind of beauty. And I know there's movements these days that are trying to push against that sort of stuff. But for generations, there's just been this idealized form of a man and a woman that has been presented to people. So the comparisons makes us anxious. The choices make us anxious. So in a digital world, what's the ultimate solution? I think I like what these guys are saying, which is if we get our identity from Christ, and Colossians says, clothe yourself with Christ, not Adidas or whatever the latest shoe brand is, but be content in Christ. We come into this world with nothing. We leave this world with nothing. That's what Job teaches us. That's what 1 Timothy teaches us. Then there's a contentment in that, knowing that, okay, I am who I am, and in Christ I'm made in the image of God, and I've been given gifts through the Spirit to be able to use those gifts. And I think that an active Christian life is a content Christian life. Because if you're actually living the way you've been designed to live as a human being, as one who's in relationship with your Heavenly Father, and you're actually got an intimate relationship with the Lord, and you're actually living out of that, that is going to bring a contentment.
Yeah, right. I think that makes sense. Incidentally, Usain Bolt ran at 44.72 kilometres an hour.
44?
Yeah, between metre 60 and metre 80 of the 100-metre sprint at the 2009 World Championship Athletics. 44 kilometres an hour. That's like a school zone. Faster than a school zone. You get picked up.
I wonder if that's why they set a 40-kilometre speed limit. And just some kid being hit by a Usain Bolt. Oh my gosh. It wouldn't be as bad as being hit by something moving fast.
When I looked at it, I'm like, that is extremely surprising.
That's really quick, eh?
Yeah.
That's 4 times faster than I thought.
Yeah, look, there's another question here. How many kilometres an hour is 100 metres in 9.58 seconds? 37.58 kilometres an hour. But that is the fastest people in the world, though. Fastest person in the world. That's very fast. Let's going back to that idea of cultural discernment. I thought we could dive into that a little bit more. I want to ask you, what do you think that cultural discernment means? Because does it mean just, I'm not going to watch that TV show, or I'm not going to listen to those lyrics, or I think that's one element of it, but I feel like that maybe only scrapes the surface a little bit. I think it probably does come back to our relationship with Jesus and what we do in each situation. But if someone said, as a Christian, how do you practice cultural discernment? What do you think you'd say?
Yeah, so that's why you mentioned Andy Crouch a little earlier. He vibed off Nibar's concept of there's different gestures and postures we can have to culture. A gesture is a one-off response to culture, and a posture is an ongoing response to culture. So Crouch argues that we can either just blithely consume culture and not think about it. He argues that we can critique culture, which is kind of what we're doing today, sit around chatting about it. You can condemn culture, which we do sometimes. Some things we condemn. Or you can copy culture. And so he argues that all of those, though, are passive postures that we can develop. So as a gesture, it's okay to condemn some things, but if we're always condemning things and we have a whole show on it and we're just constantly condemning culture, it actually doesn't help us to interact with culture and actually impact the culture in an ongoing way. That's his argument.
Anyway. And we're kind of seen as like kind of hermetized Christians who are like, they just shelter themselves from everything?
Yeah. So there's a positive or a negative. So you either consume or copy it, or you critique or condemn it.
Okay.
So either of those 4 are passive. But he says the best posture to have is a creative posture. So one of the reasons we do this podcast is it's a creative endeavour. As well as critiquing, we're also creating our own culture by talking about concepts that we think are helpful for people in the shock absorber concept to put into practice that can actually be something we can be doing. Because Crouch argues that creates that means that Christians actually contribute to culture making rather than just stand off and watch it being created.
Do you have an example that you've been researching it for your PhD? Is there an example that you can think of that really stood out to you in terms of Christians creating culture? There's Christian music we've talked about before. Is there anything else?
Well, some people argue contemporary Christian music is a form of copying culture. Because they often copy the various like
what's popular in the wider
styles. Yeah. But I actually don't know if I fully agree with that. I'm still thinking it through because I actually look at someone like Larry Norman, and he was too Christian for the world, but he was a bit too worldly for the church.
Yeah.
So he didn't really fit in either. And I think it's interesting that he used to sing about, well, he used to challenge the adults in the church, and he used to challenge Christians in the church, and he used to challenge people outside of the church to think about living for Christ. But I think living for Christ is the ultimate creativity. So to actually use your gifts that the Holy Spirit's given you to and produce fruit is really creative. So coming to church and trying to copy the culture with the latest music in the church, or people do that, but you know, the small conversations over a cup of tea afterwards can be incredibly impacting to people.
Yeah, and I think
that's creative. But then on top of that, you can actually get confident to do some of the things you're doing, like the Soul Revival apparel is not just copying the world, it's creating cultural goods that we wear that help us to have conversations with people, but it also just is a fun identity that we have as Christians too.
Yeah, I remember when we kind of relaunched that apparel kind of brand, you know, a couple of years ago, you were really helpfully at pains to describe it as like, we've got to make sure that we explain the reasons why we're doing it and not just think about, oh, it's like church merch or something like that. Are we doing it just to raise money for the church, or are we? And some people have been burnt by that in terms of they didn't like that approach. And I think that was really helpful for us to think really kind of biblically about, well, we want to create this for our community and just to enjoy wearing it, and hopefully it looks reasonably stylish, that they want to wear it outside of church, and it can create conversations around it and stuff like that as well. But there's also another thing of, especially when we've designed the Week Away is coming up for us, and we like to do some jumpers for Week Away, and to go the talks of that Anthony Douglas is doing for us, talking a lot about God's sovereignty and free will, and the discussion around that. And one thing that I encourage the guys that were designing is like, let's dive into what the Bible's saying about it first, and make sure you read some of these passages before we just go, oh, we're just going to do something that looks cool. Which was really, but I got that from your leadership. I think that was really helpful to think about that. But then because we're doing that, and it's kind of going back to what's our relationship with Jesus first, then how do we produce a cultural good or create a cultural good that is going to reflect that? And so I think I'm really proud of the one that we've done this year. You can probably see it at some point when it comes out, but I feel like it's the most, like the closest we've done to that for some reason. I'm wearing one that we did a couple of years ago, and it's doing the same thing, but I think that we're a bit more nuanced in it this year, which has been really exciting. And I think what's interesting, coming back to the book, they talk about things that young people struggling with, because a lot of their research is for 18 to 29-year-olds. But some of the things that they talk about are education by search engine. We've got all these things, but if I educate myself by a search engine, there's still so many things that aren't presenting a single source of truth to me. So that can create that anxiety that we're talking about.
It's a good example.
Yeah, and the tyranny of now. They also talk about that everything is now, so we don't have time to spend time on things. But then also, even if we're passing the time, we can't be bored. We can't be thinking about things because we're distracted by screens a lot. But one of the things that they say is a counterpoint to that is the resilience of wisdom. And I think that's even something we talk about in the Shock Absorber as well, is that, well, what's our young people are bringing to us? What's going on in the culture?
That's really good, isn't
it? And then how do we bring
Isn't that exciting?
Wisdom?
Yeah, so they're kind of dipping their toe into the same kind of stuff.
Similar kind of stuff, right? And that's what I think is really exciting. And then they actually go through quite a few examples in the Bible, whether it's Joseph, Jeremiah, Daniel, about how important wisdom is in order to take that piece of cultural discernment and go, well, what should we do about this?
Yeah.
And I think it's also, but if you're not spending time in the Bible and having that personal relationship with Jesus, I don't think you can do that. What do you reckon?
So my thought is we've got to create a space where those conversations can happen.
Right.
And how do we slow down as Christians? And so that's one of the reasons why we do things like have dinners and meals. Yeah. But also one of the things I really like to do is I just went up to Colliinabri on the weekend to the River Convention. Now, River Convention is what some of our Aboriginal brothers and sisters have designed to encourage the church out in the northwest, particularly Aboriginal churches. And we've been going out to those for the last 20 years. And they basically gather for a few meetings during the weekend, and they'll sing a lot, have a lot of testimony. Someone will present a word, give a sermon, and then there'll be like heaps of time sitting around, having dinner, just sitting around a campfire, that kind of stuff. And one of these conversations came up last weekend, which is really interesting that you should raise it, because I was sitting at the campfire with a young friend of mine, and he just started going out with a new girlfriend that he's met at Brewarrina, and she was a teacher who came from Sydney to go up to be a teacher at Brewarrina, and they met, and it's lovely. They've become friends. And anyway, they were sitting together, and we were just sitting around the fire, and I said, "Oh, I like your shoes." And she said, "Oh, cool." She was wearing Doc Martens. And I said, "Yeah, I've got a pair of Docs." And she was funny. She said, "Oh, so you're trying to be a hipster and being young like us?" And I said, "Oh, that's really funny." And without being offended or also being condescending, I tried to explain that Doc Marten boots are a semiotic or a symbolic kind of shoe to certain cultures that go further back than just the hipster movement of the 2000s, that when I was a young person, wearing Docs in the 1980s was very cool. And I was explaining to her that it was cool to a lot of different subcultures too. It wasn't just one subculture. So everyone wore Docs there at one stage in the late 80s, early 90s. And if someone was an environmentalist, they'd wear green laces on the Docs. Oh. And if they were a white supremacist, they'd wear white laces.
Really?
If they were a lesbian, they'd wear purple laces. Huh. If they were gay, they'd have gay rainbow laces, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these different people and different tribes wearing Docs, but there was this kind of fun sort of across the board kind of thing where everyone was wearing Docs, but they distinguished it by these laces. And then she was just wearing black laces. And I said, "Oh, well, back in the 80s, if you wore black laces, that was just you wore Docs. You weren't really particularly in any of those different tribes." So and she said, "Oh, what tribe were you in?" I said, "Oh, I just wore black laces. I just like punk music, and I had black stove jeans and Docs and a black T-shirt. That's pretty much what I used to wear when I was a teenager." And yeah, but that wisdom that comes from, she didn't know that, and that deep dive into something deeper. Yeah. She likes this fashion accessory. But to many millennials and to many Zoomers, like there's sort of like this unknownness that goes, if you think back to the last century, it's sort of people don't have as much knowledge of what happened even in the 1980s and 90s. It's interesting because in the 80s, we were really interested in what happened in the 60s and earlier. And, if we listened to a band and we heard they were influenced by a band in the 60s, we'd go to the record store and buy that record and listen to that as well. But there's only so much of that you can do. And commentators are saying today that you either look forward or you look back now. There's that much cultural stuff to have in popular music. Again, the issue of choice. You can't really be an expert of everything now. So you kind of either specialise in the history of classical rock and roll, or you look forward to all the different stuff there is now, all the different genres now. So that wisdom piece. And it was a really fun conversation that we all enjoyed. And it wasn't a angsty one, or it was really interesting. But the more we talked about that sort of stuff, and I said, "Oh, what do you like about Doc Martens?" She said, "I just like they symbolise to her an alternative lifestyle." I said, "Well, that's the same thing that we vibe back in the day." And she said, "What was alternative to you?" And I said, "Well, funny you should say that, but being a Christian was alternative, because even though we had alternative music and indie music, I used to think being a Christian is as alternative as you can get to follow Jesus, who calls us to not be like the world." That was very exciting for me as a young person. Yeah.
I was just thinking, when you were relating that story about the Doc Martens, do you think, and also thinking about the search engine, like education by search engine, and we can get information wherever we want now. Do you think there's a distrust for the younger people in wisdom then? Because they're like, I can just go find it myself. I don't need to listen to you.
Yeah, and I think it's a funny thing, like, because I've been a youth minister a long time, I really like teenage culture, and I loved teenagers because it's almost like a reset every generation. So the human race, it strives to excess all the time, and then each generation, teenagers rebel against what happened in the earlier generation, and sort of it means that there's something good about that, but there's also a downside. So the downside obviously is that there's no solutions to the problems I'm experiencing now from the past, and all the solutions are in the present or the future. And that sort of view of history is not helpful either. I think that's what we're striving for with the shock absorber, that a shock absorber needs to be strong and flexible. You need flexibility of the new ideas and the strength of the old ones together. And I think we're trying to work out how to do that in the church. But yeah, I think we've been able to muddle along, I think.
I think it's probably more than muddling. Because we kind of talked about a few things in regards to what we could be doing within just ourselves and then within church. And one of the things is you spend some more time together rather than just out in the world. One of the things here they say is that some people are sometimes not prepared. Some Christians are not prepared to engage in culture. But then they also go further and say, don't just engage. So there's a kind of, sometimes there can be a thing of like a tense argument, for example, when you, as a Christian, you disagree with something. But sometimes it's just like, let's see who can win the argument. But he also says here, don't just engage, prepare to engage. And as I have a look at that in terms of resilient disciples, how do you think that we prepare to engage? I think it ties to what you're saying. Like, if we spend more time together, we actually we actually more encouraged and feel more equipped to be out in the world living as Christians. And that's where that cultural discernment can come from, is we need to be anchored to the Bible and be anchored to Jesus, and then anchored to other Christians who help us to even distill those things down that we experience in the culture. I just wanted to ask you, is there anything else that you think in terms of being prepared to engage with the culture that you've seen over your time in ministry that actually helps people go out into the wider community and actually go, I am a resilient disciple? Because resiliency isn't just about, I'm a Christian. Resiliency is in the face of things as well. So when you disagree with something, or you say, I'm not going to engage with that, how do we help people to prepare to engage? Yeah,
that's unreal. Pause. Can we have this as the last question?
Yes.
Because I've got to get back.
I've got to. I'll wrap it up with this quote from Bonhoeffer, actually.
Yeah, good. I think that's a terrific question, and it might even be worth referring to again down the track, because I think that I have a interesting conversation with some of my Christian friends who are teachers and leaders, and some of my friends think we don't do enough to equip people for the workplace, for example, to engage in culture in the workplace, and they think we need to give people more tools. Now, there is some sense to that I would agree with, but I think one of the things I've been influenced by is because I studied at Sydney University when I was younger. Sydney University sometimes compared themselves to another Sydney university called the University of New South Wales. And it might not have been a fair comparison, but some of my lecturers said the difference between Sydney Uni and New South Wales Uni is that Sydney wants to teach you how to think, not what to think. But New South Wales can sometimes be more orientated to helping people to get into their careers and their profession and focus on what to think. And so my hesitancy with my friends might come from that, because I like the idea that if I read the Bible by myself and I'm spending quality time with the Lord as I read the Bible as an individual, and I'm praying and I'm seeking to grow as a person in Christ, and I'm in a group of people that are seeking to do that. Karl Barth says that we have the Bible as our authority, and then the community, we work out in community how to apply it. If we're doing that regularly, then I think we're equipped for many different situations that we'll encounter. So I come up to a decision I have to make where there's lots of choices that I might be normally anxious about, but because I'm already reading the Bible and I'm working that through with a group of people at church, I might come into a cafe and go to buy a drink and not be stressed about it, because I might think to myself, actually, it doesn't matter what I have to drink. Maybe something healthy probably wouldn't be a bad idea, but I'm not really missing out on anything if I actually take that drink or that drink. I don't have to squeeze every experience that is worthwhile and beautiful into one lifetime, because this lifetime on earth is only the beginning. It's not the full experience that I'm going to experience. So if I've got a contentment that comes from being in Christ through already being clothed with Christ every day and working out what that looks like in community, then I actually think I'm better equipped to be resilient in the world, and I'm able to engage with the world in a quieter way that isn't as fraught and frenetic. And one last thing I'd say on that is, I think when I was younger, the experience I had with that I used to get stressed about was, my parents were great and they weren't super materialistic, so they weren't, lavishing me with things all the time. But if I got a new pair of, shorts that were a cool brand that I really liked, I'd get really stressed if I ripped them, or if I got a ink stain on them or something like that, because I might not get another pair till Christmas, or I might not be able to get that again. And I think looking back, I used to get really anxious about stuff because I was worried about that. But then somewhere along the way, I just went, well, if this gets broken, it's just a piece of shorts. It's not a big deal. And that's the wisdom piece that takes time to come, I think. And I think anxiety comes from lots of different things, and sometimes people are clinically anxious and need to see a doctor. And if that's the case for any of you listening, please seek help if you need help with anxiety. But there's also, I think no matter, even in just a broad sweep of thinking about this topic, if we want resilience within this digital world and we're firm in our identity in Christ, I think that really helps.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. And a really good way to kind of wrap it up. We just, in the last episode, we were talking about Bonhoeffer, and he's come up in a lot of the podcasts we talk about. Because again, a great example of a resilient disciple is probably Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So. I'm getting close to finishing this biography on him, and it's talking about how we're at the point where he got arrested for being part of the conspiracy to take down Hitler. And just before that, there was a lot of discussion around amongst Christian circles about how do we approach this, because he was very much like we need to do something about Hitler because for very many reasons. But he wrote a piece or an essay that he distributed just to his close Christian friends. But there's this quote right at the end that I thought was really good, and we can probably finish on that. It says, he wrote, "Who stands fast? Only the man whose final standard is not his reason, his principles, his conscience, his freedom, or his virtue, but who is ready to sacrifice all this when he is called to obedient and responsible action in faith and in exclusive allegiance to God. The responsible man who tries to make his whole life an answer to the question and call of God." Anyway, I just thought that was helpful.
That's a really good way to end.
Yeah, really good way to end. Anyway, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. It was really fun.
It was a fun chat. Thank you very much.
It was really good.
And if you enjoyed the fun chat and you want to contribute to it more, you can email me, joel@shockabsorber.com.au, and we will definitely have a chat about it. And Dave Stonestreet keeps emailing me. We're going to get him on the podcast,
Yeah,
I think.
Dave's a legend.
So
he's right into this kind of stuff. Actually, just as a teaser, if we can get him on, we need to ask him this. One of the best things he taught me when we were younger as friends is he said, if you choose to do one thing, you can't do something else. I really like that.
Yeah,
so that's something to dive into.
Well, that's a good way of talking about resilient discipleship as well. So I appreciate that. Anyway, thank you very much, Stu. Thank you, everyone listening and watching. And we always finish with a one way.
One way.